The late sun draped Los Angeles in a soft golden haze, the kind of light that made every surface glow with deceptive warmth. Grace stood on the sidewalk, just outside the small cafe she often passed but rarely entered. The windows were fogged from the heat of the espresso machines inside, silhouettes shifting in a dance of normalcy that felt foreign to her pounding heart. Her breath caught as she noticed him, Brandon, across the street. That smile, the confident, self-assured grin she once adored, now twisted in her memory like a blade. He walked with the same ease as always, as if the world existed to part for him. She felt her stomach plummet. Not today, not him, not when she had barely managed to stitch herself back together after the way he'd broken her. Her body begged her to move, but her legs rooted to the concrete. Panic clawed up her throat, leaving her dizzy. She scanned desperately for an escape, for a shield, for anything to hold between herself and the storm she knew Brandon would bring. That was when her eyes landed on him, a man near the cafe entrance, tall, lean but broad-shouldered, wrapped in a dark blazer that fit him too perfectly to be casual. His posture radiated a calm authority, an ease that seemed out of place in the chaos of the city street. He wasn't scrolling on his phone or fidgeting with impatience like the others waiting outside. He simply stood there, unhurried, as if time answered to him. Before she could second-guess herself, Grace found her feet moving toward him. Her voice broke through the panic, trembling and rushed. "Excuse me, I know this is going to sound completely insane, but, sir, can you be my boyfriend for a few minutes?" The words tumbled out too fast, absurd even to her own ears. Her cheeks flamed as his head turned slightly, his eyes catching hers. They were startlingly blue, steady, sharp, and almost too perceptive, as if they could see every frantic thought tearing through her. For a breathless beat, he said nothing. He only studied her, calm as the tide, while Brandon's footsteps closed in from behind. "I'm sorry," she stammered, voice cracking under the weight of her desperation. "It's just, my ex, he's coming, and I don't want to do this alone. Please, just for a few minutes, I'll explain later." Something softened in his gaze, though his lips curved into the faintest hint of amusement. It wasn't cruel, it was curious, almost intrigued. He shifted slightly, closing the distance between them. Then, without a word, he extended his hand. His fingers slid through hers, firm and deliberate, as though they had always belonged there. "I'm Charles," he said quietly, voice smooth, deep, carrying an accent she couldn't place. He gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "And apparently, I'm your boyfriend now." Relief hit her chest so hard she nearly sagged against him. His touch was steady, anchoring her storm. She barely had time to breathe before Brandon's voice cut through the evening air. "Grace?" She turned, her new anchor still beside her. Brandon stood only a few steps away, shock flickering in his eyes. He masked it quickly with that easy charm, but she could see the confusion, the calculation behind his smirk. "Wow, what a coincidence running into you here." His gaze darted to Charles, lingering with curiosity. "And gee, this is?" Charles moved a fraction closer, just enough that she could feel the heat of his body, his presence wrapping around her like armor. His free hand extended politely toward Brandon, his smile courteous but edged with something firmer. "I'm Charles, Grace's boyfriend." The words landed with the weight of truth. Brandon blinked, caught off guard. For once, his confidence faltered. He shook Charles's hand, but his grip lacked its usual dominance. "Boyfriend?" he echoed, incredulous. "Yes," Grace said, finding her voice steady for the first time in months. "Boyfriend." The strength surprised her, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to surface. Charles draped an arm over her shoulder, a gesture so natural it silenced whatever retort Brandon had been forming. His touch was warm, protective without being possessive. Grace leaned into it instinctively, and with that small movement, she felt something click. Safety, presence, a reminder that she wasn't small, wasn't weak. Brandon's jaw worked, but the words never came. He glanced between them, searching for cracks in the facade, and found none. Finally, with a reluctant nod, he muttered, "Maybe we'll talk later, Grace." "Maybe," she said firmly. He hesitated, then turned and disappeared into the stream of strangers on the sidewalk. The moment he was gone, Grace exhaled a long, trembling breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Wow," she whispered, still gripping Charles's hand. He looked down at her with those piercing blue eyes, something unreadable flickering in them. Curiosity, concern, maybe something more. "You're okay?" he asked softly. For the first time in months, Grace realized she was. The cafe smelled of roasted beans and cinnamon, the kind of warmth that usually settled Grace's nerves, but today her pulse was still racing. She sat across from the stranger who had just played her boyfriend, her fingers wrapped tightly around the cappuccino cup as if it might steady her. Charles leaned back in his chair with the kind of calm only certain men carried, the kind that hinted at strength without arrogance. His eyes, still impossibly blue, watched her with quiet curiosity. "You realize you just saved me from a disaster," Grace said, her voice a mix of gratitude and disbelief. I don't usually run up to strangers and ask them to pretend to be my boyfriend. Charles stirred his espresso slowly, his lips twitching into a subtle smile. That's a shame, it worked surprisingly well. Grace blinked, heat rising to her cheeks. Was he teasing her or serious? You think this is my usual flirting strategy? She asked, half amused, half embarrassed. His gaze held hers steadily. If it is, it's effective. Grace laughed nervously, the sound sharper than she intended. It wasn't flirting, it was desperation. Brandon, he has this way of making me feel small, I couldn't face him alone. Her voice faltered, and she looked down at the foam in her cup. Charles's tone softened. But you didn't seem small just now. You seemed strong, determined. Something in his words unsettled her, not in a bad way, but in the way someone's honesty strikes deeper than expected. She looked at him properly then, really looked. There was something about the way he sat with such ease, the way he observed without rushing to fill the silence. It felt rare, dangerous even, for someone like her, who wasn't used to being seen so clearly. She drew a breath and admitted what she hadn't told anyone. Brandon cheated, said it was a mistake, that we could move past it. But it wasn't just about forgiveness, it was about trust. He thought he could say a few words and I would fall back in line, like I was some prize he could reclaim. Charles nodded, his expression unreadable yet undeniably engaged. And today you were avoiding him because you didn't want to feel that way again. Grace's chest tightened. Yes, I didn't want him to twist me into doubting myself. I didn't want to lose the ground I've gained these past few months. Charles studied her for a moment, his eyes flickering with something she couldn't name. Respect perhaps, or understanding. Then, with the faintest curve of a smile, he said, maybe you've had that courage all along, you just needed a reminder. Grace's laugh was soft, unsure. You give out reminders to desperate women often, only when they're worth reminding, he replied. Her heart stuttered at the quiet certainty in his tone. She was supposed to feel ridiculous for dragging a stranger into her chaos, but instead she felt lighter, almost as if she had stumbled into something she didn't know she had been searching for. Before she could respond, the bell above the cafe door chimed. Her breath caught as she saw Brandon reappear, scanning the room with determined eyes. Grace's stomach dropped. She wasn't ready for another confrontation, but before she could move, Charles's hand reached across the table and covered hers. Strong, steady, protective. His thumb traced a small circle on her skin, grounding her. Stay calm, he murmured, not looking away from her. If he comes over, we're not pretending anymore, we're convincing. Grace's pulse thundered in her ears. She wanted to pull back, to run, but instead she squeezed his hand tighter. For the first time since the breakup, she didn't feel cornered, she felt ready, and that terrified her even more. The streets outside glowed with the fading light of Los Angeles as Grace and Charles stepped out of the cafe together. She hadn't planned to spend more than 5 minutes with this stranger, yet here she was walking beside him, her hand still tingling from where he had held it. The air was cooler now, the city humming with energy, and she could not tell if the shiver that ran down her spine came from the evening breeze or the man beside her. Charles glanced at her, his expression calm yet touched with a spark of amusement. Would you like to continue our act for a little while longer, he asked, his voice low but steady. Grace blinked, caught off guard. What do you mean, she asked. His lips curved into a playful smile. Technically, we are still a couple in the eyes of your ex. Why waste such a convincing performance when we could enjoy the rest of the afternoon together? Grace hesitated, her ton juridichin, heart torn between common sense and the strange pull she felt toward him. Every part of her wanted to play it safe, to retreat home and lock the door. Yet when she looked at Charles, standing there so effortlessly composed, she felt that same wave of courage that had surprised her back in the cafe. Against her better judgment, she nodded. All right, but if this turns into a disaster, it is your fault. He laughed softly, a warm sound that made her chest tighten. I accept full responsibility. They walked toward the boardwalk at Venice Beach, the salty air carrying the sounds of music and laughter. Street performers juggled fire, artists painted quick portraits, children ran with cotton candy in their hands. Grace felt herself loosening, the tension that had coiled in her chest for months unraveling with each step. Charles was different here, lighter, making dry observations about strangers that made her laugh until she forgot who might be watching. At one point, he pointed discreetly to a man in a sharp suit yelling into his phone near the sand. $5 says he is arguing about the color of tablecloths at a wedding reception. Grace laughed and shook her head. No way, he is clearly closing a big business deal. They edged closer, pretending to admire the ocean. The man's voice carried over the surf. I don't care if it's ivory or eggshell, Sarah. They are both white. Grace clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle her laughter as Charles arched an eyebrow at her, smug in his victory. For the first time in months, she laughed without restraint, without fear of being judged. As they walked further down the beach, the waves licked at their feet. Grace kicked off her shoes, daring herself to step into the icy water. She felt alive, untethered, but just as she was beginning to believe in the magic of this strange afternoon, a large wave rolled in, catching her by surprise. She stumbled, slipping in the wet sand, and before she could fall, Charles caught her, his arms wrapped firmly around her waist, pulling her against him. Their faces were only inches apart, his heartbeat quick beneath her palms. "Careful," he murmured, his voice rougher than before. Grace swallowed, breathless. The world around them seemed to dissolve into nothing but the crash of the waves and the man holding her as if letting go was not an option. "Thank you," she whispered. Charles's gaze darkened, searching her face as if for permission. "May I kiss you this time?" Grace's chest tightened. Brandon had never asked, Brandon had always taken, but Charles waited, his strength tempered by patience. She found herself nodding, her voice trembling but sure. Yes. The kiss was slow at first, deliberate, carrying a tenderness that broke past the walls she had built. Then it deepened, powerful and undeniable, leaving her breathless when they finally parted. But before she could speak, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He frowned, answering with a tone far heavier than the carefree man she had seen all afternoon. Grace caught fragments of his words, carried on the wind. "Not tonight. I said I would handle it. She doesn't need to know yet." Her stomach tightened. Who was he really? What kind of life did he live that required secrecy? Even now the laughter of the boardwalk carried on around them, but Grace's heart no longer beat with ease. The stranger she had kissed was suddenly more mysterious than ever, and she was no longer sure if she had stepped into something beautiful or something dangerous. The glow of the boardwalk faded as evening settled, the sky painted in deep purples and streaks of orange. Grace and Charles left the beach behind, their clothes still damp from the ocean spray, their laughter quieter now, replaced by something heavier. The warmth of his kiss lingered on her lips, but so did the words she had overheard from his phone call. She tried to push it away, to hold on to the carefree joy she had felt with him only minutes ago, but questions clawed at her mind. Charles guided her toward a small Mexican restaurant tucked on a corner, its colorful lights strung across the patio flickering against the darkening sky. "Hungry?" he asked casually, though his voice carried a hint of distraction. Grace nodded, though her thoughts weren't on food. She followed him inside, the smell of sizzling fish and warm tortillas wrapping around them. The waiter's eyes lit up the moment he saw Charles. "Mr. Whitmore," he said in smooth Spanish, before switching to English. "Your usual table is ready." Grace froze. Whitmore. The name hung in her ears like a note that didn't belong to the song. She glanced at Charles, whose polite smile didn't falter. He thanked the waiter in flawless Spanish, leading her to a table by the window overlooking the glowing ocean. Grace sat slowly, her mind racing. Who was this man really? How did a stranger she had begged for help on the street suddenly become someone who had a usual table in restaurants where even the air seemed expensive? Before she could ask, a shadow fell across their table. A woman in her 50s, elegantly dressed in a tailored navy dress and pearls, leaned in to kiss both of Charles's cheeks with practiced familiarity. Her perfume was subtle yet commanding, her presence radiating influence. "Charles, darling," she said brightly. "What a surprise, I thought you had investors tonight." Grace's stomach tightened. Investors? Charles stiffened almost imperceptibly before recovering. "Margaret, always a pleasure," he said smoothly. "I postponed the meeting." Margaret's gaze shifted to Grace, polite but sharp, as though evaluating a painting she wasn't sure belonged in the gallery. "And who is this?" "Margaret Sinclair," Charles said, placing his hand gently over Grace's on the table. "This is Grace." His touch was steady, grounding, but Grace felt the weight of the introduction. Margaret's smile was pleasant, but her eyes searched Grace with subtle calculation. "Lovely to meet you," Margaret said, though her tone suggested judgment more than warmth. "Charles rarely introduces us to his friends." Grace forced a polite smile, but something inside her bristled. Before she could respond, Margaret straightened, her attention returning to Charles. "Don't forget, the board meeting is early tomorrow. Your father will expect your report." Grace caught the flash of tension in Charles's jaw before he masked it with a practiced smile. "I won't forget," he replied. Margaret gave Grace one last lingering look before gliding away, leaving behind the faint scent of expensive perfume and a storm of unanswered questions. Silence pressed between them for a moment, broken only by the clink of glasses around the restaurant. Grace's fingers tightened slightly beneath Charles's hand. "Board meeting?" she asked, her voice careful. "What kind of family business exactly?" Charles looked at her, blue eyes steady but carrying something he wasn't ready to share. he exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. It's complicated. Then explain it simply, Grace pressed, her heart thudding. Before he could answer, his phone vibrated again on the table. He glanced at the screen and frowned. I need to take this, he said quietly, standing and stepping a few paces away. Grace tried to focus on the menu, but fragments of his conversation drifted over when the wind carried his voice. Not until tomorrow. I told you it isn't the right time. She doesn't need to know yet. Her pulse quickened. She looked out at the ocean, but the waves did nothing to calm her. She had thought she was finally learning who Charles was, yet with every answer came two more questions. Margaret's words echoed in her mind. Board meeting, investors, father, Whitmore. When Charles returned, his smile was easy, but his shoulders carried tension he couldn't hide. Sorry about that. Sometimes work doesn't respect schedules. Grace searched his face, torn between the warmth of the man who had kissed her on the beach and the shadows of the stranger who kept his truths locked away. Charles, she said softly, who are you really? For the first time, his eyes faltered. He hesitated, then reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. Tomorrow night, he said, his voice low, almost pleading. Let me show you everything. Grace held his gaze, her heart torn between fear and fascination. She nodded slowly, though unease coiled in her stomach. The man who had made her laugh, who had given her back her courage, was wrapped in secrets far larger than she had imagined, and as the night stretched on, she realized she might already be in too deep to turn back. The next evening arrived far too quickly for Grace. All day she found herself distracted, shelving books at the store without noticing their titles, replaying Charles's words in her mind. Tomorrow night, let me show you everything. The weight of that promise sat heavy in her chest. What could he possibly reveal that he hadn't already hinted at? What secrets could make a man so guarded, yet so determined to be honest with her? By the time the clock struck 7, she stood outside her apartment building, her nerves wrapped in gately around her. A sleek black car rolled up to the curb, its polished surface reflecting the city lights like liquid glass. The driver stepped out and opened the back door with a slight bow. Inside sat Charles, dressed in a dark suit that sharpened every line of his already commanding presence. You came, he said softly, his voice tinged with relief. I said I would, Grace replied, though her heart pounded so loudly she wondered if he could hear it. The ride was silent at first, the city flashing past in blurs of neon and headlights. She stole glances at him, noting the way his jaw clenched when he thought she wasn't looking, the way his fingers tapped against his knee in restless rhythm. He was nervous too. That realization steadied her, if only slightly. After winding through the hills, the car slowed before enormous iron gates marked with a discreet plaque, Whitmore Private Estate. Grace's breath caught. The gates opened smoothly without hesitation, and the car rolled forward into a world she had only ever glimpsed in glossy magazines. The driveway stretched like a private road, flanked by perfectly sculpted gardens glowing under subtle lights. At the end rose a mansion that seemed carved from glass and stone, its lines modern yet timeless, the kind of architecture designed not just to impress but to dominate. Grace's throat tightened. This was not a home, this was a statement. Charles stepped out first and offered her his hand. She hesitated only a moment before placing hers in his. His grip was firm, reassuring, though she sensed the vulnerability beneath it. Are you all right? He asked quietly. I don't know yet, she admitted, her eyes still fixed on the towering structure before them. Inside, the house was breathtaking in its silence. Marble floors reflected the warm glow of recessed lights. Expensive art lined the walls, paintings Grace suspected were originals, not prints. Glass walls revealed sweeping views of Los Angeles glittering below like a sea of stars. She felt as though she had stepped into a world that wasn't real, a stage soid tea for someone else's life. They settled into a vast living room with furniture arranged like sculptures, elegant yet somehow uninviting. Charles poured them both a glass of wine, the same Bordeaux she had seen him order effortlessly the night before. When he handed her the glass, his eyes were steady but shadowed. My grandfather started Whitmore Industries more than 60 years ago, he began, his voice low. It was a small construction company. Over the decades it became one of the largest private corporations on the West Coast. Real estate, hospitality, technology. The company touches nearly every part of this city. Grace stared at him, trying to piece it together. And you, I'm the heir, he said simply, the next in line. My father has been grooming me for years to take full control. Her glass trembled in her hand. Heir, she repeated. The word tasted foreign. So when Margaret mentioned the board meeting, she was reminding me of my duties, Charles said, a trace of bitterness in his tone. 15,000 employees, Billions in assets, a family name tied to power I never asked for. Grace turned away, walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city sparkled below, but her chest felt heavy. She thought of her tiny apartment, her old car that coughed to life on cold mornings, the bookstore where she earned just enough to scrape by. Her world and his were galaxies apart. "That's why people recognized you," she whispered. "That's why you knew everyone, why doors opened for you. All this time you let me believe you were just Charles." "I never lied to you," he said quickly, stepping closer. "Everything I told you about myself, about how I felt with you, it was all real. I just left out details that change the way people look at me." She turned sharply to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Details? You call this a detail? You are one of the richest men in this city, and you let me sit there thinking you were just another stranger. You let me open up to you, kiss you, trust you, and all along you knew I was standing in the dark." Charles reached for her hand, but stopped short when she pulled back. His shoulders sagged with something that looked dangerously close to defeat. "Grace, I wanted one day where I could be just a man, not an heir, not a Whitmore, just a man who met a woman who made him feel alive." Grace's chest tightened at the rawness in his voice, but she shook her head. "I don't know how to process this. I don't know how to see you now. Yesterday you were a stranger who made me laugh. Tonight you are a billionaire who belongs to another world." Her voice cracked on the last word. She set the untouched wine on the table and turned toward the door. Charles stood frozen, his hand half raised, his eyes filled with something she couldn't bear to decipher. "Grace, please," he said, the plea in his voice breaking through his usual composure. But she couldn't stay. Her chest ached, her legs trembled, and the weight of his truth pressed too hard against her fragile courage. Without another word she walked away, each step echoing through the cavernous halls of the mansion, and for the first time since she had met Charles, she felt utterly alone. The days after her visit to Charles's mansion were restless and hollow. Grace found herself standing in the bookstore, rearranging shelves she had already organized, her mind replaying every word, every detail of what she had seen. She could not forget the way the estate loomed over Los Angeles, or the quiet pain in Charles's voice when he said he just wanted to be a man for one day. But no matter how much she tried to understand him, the truth felt too heavy. She belonged to paperbacks and second-hand dreams. He belonged to glass towers and boardrooms filled with people who spoke in millions. On Thursday morning, the familiar jingle of the bookstore bell startled her. She glanced up, expecting a customer, but froze when she saw Brandon stepping inside. His tailored suit was sharp, his smile as self-assured as ever, but to Grace it looked hollow now, like a mask she had learned to see through. "Brandon," she said coldly, clutching a book to steady herself. "What are you doing here?" "I came to check on you," he said smoothly, leaning against the counter as if he owned the place. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about the other day, seeing you with him." Grace narrowed her eyes. "With Charles, my boyfriend." Brandon's smirk deepened. "Boyfriend, yes, about that. I did some research." He let the word hang, savoring the tension. "Charles Whitmore, heir to Whitmore Industries, estimated worth $3 billion. Grace, do you have any idea what kind of world you just stumbled into?" Her stomach twisted. She hated the way he said the name, as if he had won something. "So what?" she snapped, forcing her voice to stay steady. "So what?" Brandon laughed, but it was sharp and ugly. "Be realistic. A man like him doesn't end up with someone like you. He's playing, Grace. Maybe you're a distraction, maybe you're an experiment, but you are not his future." Anger rose in her chest, hot and undeniable. "You don't know anything about Charles, and you sure as hell don't know anything about me." Brandon stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "I know men like him, I know how this works, and you, Grace, you'll end up crushed. Better to realize it now than later." Before she could answer, the bell over the door chimed again. Both turned to see Charles standing in the doorway. He wasn't dressed in a suit this time, just a pale blue shirt and dark trousers, but his presence filled the room like a sudden storm. His eyes flicked from Brandon to Grace, reading the scene in an instant. "Am I interrupting?" Charles asked, his voice calm but edged with quiet warning. Brandon grinned, extending his hand as if to claim some victory. "Charles Whitmore, nice to officially meet you. Brandon Mills, Grace's ex." Charles shook his hand briefly, his expression unreadable, but his shoulders carried a tension Grace hadn't seen before. "Likewise," he said evenly. "We were just talking about you," Brandon continued, his words sharp with implication. Grace stepped forward quickly, her voice firm. "Brandon, stop." Charles's gaze sharpened, his posture shifting subtly as he stepped closer to Grace. "Interesting," he said quietly, his tone polite but firm. "You speak of Grace's life as if she isn't standing right here." Brandon blinked, caught off guard. I was only trying to. You were being condescending, Charles interrupted, his voice low and controlled, the kind of calm that carried weight. To me and to her, Grace felt a swell of something she hadn't expected, pride. He wasn't raising his voice, wasn't posturing, he was simply drawing a line, one Brandon had never expected to face. Brandon's smile faltered, but he quickly regained it. I've known Grace for years, I know what's best for her. No, Grace said sharply, cutting through the air, you don't. Both men looked at her, but she didn't waver, her heart pounded, but her voice was clear. You think you know me because we dated for 2 years, but you never asked about my dreams, you never cared about the books I loved or the things I wanted, you betrayed me and then expected me to forgive you because we had history. That's not understanding, Brandon, that's arrogance. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the faint hum of the city outside. Charles looked at her then, his blue eyes filled with something like gratitude, as if her words had given him more than he had expected. Grace. His voice softened, but it was no less firm. You don't get to come here and tell me who I can love or what kind of life I deserve, not anymore. Brandon stared at her, stunned, his confidence crumbling in real time. At last he nodded stiffly, muttered something under his breath, and walked out, the bell chiming behind him. The bookstore fell quiet. Grace realized her hands were trembling, but before she could retreat, Charles stepped closer. His voice was softer now, almost vulnerable. Grace, thank you. For what, she asked. For defending yourself, for defending us, he said, his eyes searching hers. Do his words change anything for you? Do they confirm the fear you already had about me? Grace hesitated, then drew a deep breath. For a moment, yes, but then I realized something. He was trying to do what he always did, make me doubt myself, and I am done letting him. I'm scared, Charles, I'm scared of how different our worlds are, but I'm more scared of letting fear keep me from finding out what this could be. For the first time since the night at the mansion, Charles smiled, a true smile that softened every edge of him. Grace Walker, he murmured, you surprise me every time you open your mouth. She let out a shaky laugh. Better get used to it. And in that quiet bookstore, among stacks of forgotten stories, Grace realized she had just written the first page of her own. The night of the charity gala arrived with a weight Grace couldn't shake. Charles had asked her to attend as his official date, the words carrying more meaning than she expected. It wasn't just a dinner, it was a declaration, an introduction to a world that until a week ago she didn't even know he belonged to. She had stared at herself in the mirror for nearly an hour, doubting every choice, every detail, before finally arriving at the hotel where the event was being held. The ballroom glowed under chandeliers that looked as though they had been stolen from a palace. Glittering gowns and perfectly tailored tuxedos floated through the crowd, conversations punctuated by laughter that sounded rehearsed. Grace stood at the entrance, her breath caught in her throat, until Charles appeared beside her. He was in a black tuxedo, his bow tie neatly fixed, his presence commanding without effort. He took her hand without hesitation. You look extraordinary, he whispered, his blue eyes holding hers in a way that quieted her nerves for a moment, but as they stepped inside together, the eyes began to follow, whispers fluttered like moths around the edges of the room, heads turned, smiles tightened. Grace felt each glance like a spotlight, measuring her, categorizing her, dismissing her. Charles kept his hand firm around hers. He introduced her to donors, to politicians, to executives whose names she had only ever read in headlines. Some smiled politely, but she caught the subtle flick of their eyes over her dress, the faint curl of lips that suggested she didn't belong. One older woman, diamonds heavy on her neck, leaned close enough for Grace to smell the sharpness of her perfume. She's lovely, Charles, refreshingly, ordinary. The word burned. Charles's grip on her hand tightened, his smile never faltering as he responded. She's remarkable, he said simply, leaving no space for debate. Grace's chest swelled at the quiet defiance in his voice. The evening carried on, but Grace's discomfort deepened. Cameras flashed as photographers captured them together, and each flash felt like proof she was an intruder in this world. Then, in the middle of the dinner, someone approached their table with a phone in hand. A headline glared across the screen, already spreading online. A photo of Grace clinging to Charles outside the cafe, her face caught in panic, captioned with cruel speculation, social climber or secret romance. The article painted her as a woman who had trapped him, who was using him. Gasps rippled through the tables, Grace's chest constricted, humiliation flooding her. She stood abruptly, the weight of the room pressing in, but Charles caught her wrist gently. Don't, he said firmly, rising to his feet. Dance with me. Her eyes widened. Charles, everyone. Exactly, he interrupted. Everyone is watching, let them see the truth. He led her onto the dance floor. The music shifted, a slow, elegant waltz. Charles's hand settled at her waist, his other threading through hers, guiding her with a steadiness that steadied her too. His eyes never left hers, even as whispers circled them like vultures. "You don't have to prove anything to them," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I'm not proving anything to them," he said, his tone low and resolute. "I'm showing them who you are to me." The room blurred around her. For a moment, it was only the two of them, moving as if the world had fallen away, but Grace's mind couldn't quiet the question that haunted her. Someone had planted that article. Someone wanted to tear her down, and whoever it was had chosen tonight, in front of the most powerful eyes in the city. When the dance ended, polite applause scattered across the room, but Grace felt the tension simmering beneath it. She knew this was only the beginning. Someone in Charles's world had decided she didn't belong, and they weren't going to stop until she was gone. As Charles pressed a kiss to her hand, his jaw tight with unspoken fury, Grace realized she wasn't just fighting for her heart anymore. She was stepping into a battle she never asked for, one that could cost them both far more than reputation. It could cost them everything. The morning after the gala, Grace woke to a heavy silence in her small apartment. The glow from her phone screen confirmed what she feared most. The article that had been whispered about at the event was now everywhere. Her face plastered across headlines she never wanted, her name twisted into a story of ambition and manipulation. Strangers online called her a gold digger, others claimed she was an opportunist who had trapped the Whitmore heir. She wanted to shut it all off, but the damage was already spreading. Customers at the bookstore stared a little longer when they walked in. Two regulars whispered by the romance section, their eyes flicking toward her with curiosity. She forced a smile, but her chest ached with humiliation. By late afternoon, the real blow arrived. An envelope lay on her doorstep, crisp and official. She tore it open with trembling hands and read the words she could barely process. Notice to vacate, 30 days. The building had been purchased by a holding company. All tenants were required to leave. Her safe little corner of the city, the one place she had built a life after Brandon, was about to be stripped away. Grace sank to the floor, the paper crumpling in her fists. The timing was too sharp, too cruel to be coincidence. She thought of the whispers at the gala, of the board members' cool stares, of Margaret's sharp eyes, and she knew someone wanted her gone, not just from Charles's world, but from her own. That evening Charles appeared at her apartment. He looked less like the composed man she had met outside the cafe and more like someone carrying the weight of an empire. His tie was loosened, his hair slightly mussed, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "Grace," he said softly, seeing the letter on the table. "You got it." Her voice cracked. "It's your company, isn't it? The name on the letter matches the ones Margaret mentioned. Tell me this isn't you." Charles's jaw clenched. He picked up the paper, scanning it quickly before closing his eyes with a sigh. "It's a subsidiary, a holding division under Whitmore Industries. I didn't know they were buying this building, I swear I didn't." "But it's still your family's company," Grace said bitterly. "So whether you knew or not, it comes back to you. Do you understand what this means for me? I'll lose everything, my home, my bookstore, my life." He reached for her hands, but she pulled them away. His voice hardened. "Then I'll fix it. I'll stop the redevelopment. And what happens if you can't? What happens if your father or your board decides my entire world is nothing more than a bad investment to sweep aside?" Her eyes glistened, her breath uneven. "Do you even know how terrifying it is to realize that the man you're falling for could destroy you without even realizing it?" The silence between them was sharp enough to cut. Charles stepped back, running a hand through his hair, frustration radiating from him. "Grace, I didn't choose this empire, I never asked for it, but I can choose you, I can choose to fight for you." "Then fight," she said quietly, her voice trembling but strong. "But don't fight for me, fight with me, because I won't be saved like some helpless woman in a story. I'll fight for my home, my dreams, with or without you." Something in her words hit him harder than any boardroom confrontation ever had. He looked at her, truly looked, and saw not just the woman who had asked for a stranger's help on the sidewalk, but someone who was ready to stand against a world much larger than herself. Charles stepped closer, his voice low but burning with conviction. "Then we'll fight together. Against my family, against the board, against anyone who thinks you don't belong." Grace held his gaze, her heart pounding. For the first time, she wasn't just afraid of losing him, she was afraid of what they might both lose if this battle went too far. And deep inside, she knew the war had already begun. The next week unfolded like a storm that refused to pass. Grace tried to keep her focus on the bookstore, but every day another headline appeared. Photos of her and Charles leaving the gala hand in hand splashed across glossy magazines, her name paired with words like scandal and unworthy. Strangers whispered when she walked down the street, customers snapped photos on their phones when they thought she wasn't looking. But the worst was not the gossip, it was the letter that arrived from the city council announcing a proposal to demolish her bookstore as part of a redevelopment plan funded by Whitmore Industries. Grace read it 3 times, her hands shaking harder with every word. It wasn't just her apartment anymore, it was the one place that had been hers, the store that had given her peace after Brandon, her little world of paper and stories. Now it was marked for erasure. Charles came to her that evening, his face drawn, his usual composure fractured. "Grace, I didn't know they were targeting the store, I swear to you I didn't." Her voice was raw, her eyes blazing. "But it's your name on the plans, your company, how can I believe you when every time I turn around something else in my life is being swept aside by Whitmore money?" For a moment he said nothing, then he reached into his jacket and set a folder on the counter. She opened it hesitantly. Inside were documents, contracts, internal memos, evidence that Charles had tried to block the acquisitions. His signature stood alone in opposition. "They won't listen to me," he said, his voice low with frustration. "Not yet. My father thinks you're a distraction. Margaret believes you're a threat. The board only sees numbers. They want you erased from my life because they think you make me weak, but they don't understand you're the only thing keeping me strong." Grace's throat tightened, she wanted to believe him. And when she looked into his eyes, she saw not the heir to billions but the man who had held her hand on the sidewalk when she was breaking apart. Still, fear clawed at her. "And what happens if they force you to choose between me and them, between me and everything you've been raised to inherit?" Charles stepped closer, his voice unshakable. "Then I'll choose you." But before she could answer, a crash outside shattered the moment. Grace rushed to the window, spray paint dripped across the bookstore's front glass in red letters that screamed "Social climbers stay away." A shadow disappeared into the alley. Grace's breath caught, her sanctuary had been violated. Charles was already at the door, fury blazing in his eyes, but Grace grabbed his arm. "Don't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "That's exactly what they want, to drag you down to their level, to make you react." He turned back to her, his chest heaving, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. "Then what do we do?" Grace looked at the defaced window, at the evidence of how far people were willing to go to tear them apart. "We don't run," she said firmly, "we fight, for the store, for us, for the truth." Charles studied her, his anger slowly giving way to something fiercer, more focused. He took her hand and pressed it against his heart. "Then we fight together," he said, and in that moment Grace realized this was no longer just about a relationship, this was about survival against forces far bigger than either of them had imagined, forces that would stop at nothing to break them apart. The night air over Los Angeles was heavy with tension when Charles arrived at the bookstore. Grace stood inside, staring at the red graffiti that still stained the windows. She had refused to wash it off, insisting it remain as proof of what they were up against. The words glared at them in the dim light, cruel reminders of how far Charles's world would go to break them apart. "They won't stop," Charles said quietly as he stepped inside, his suit jacket unbuttoned, his face drawn with exhaustion. "The board, Margaret, even my father, they think removing you is the only way to protect the company's image." Grace turned to him, her eyes burning with both fear and defiance. "Then they don't just want to erase me, they want to erase everything I stand for, my home, my store, my dignity." He closed the distance between them, his voice rough. "That's why I'm done playing their game. Tomorrow there's a board meeting, I'm going to confront them all. No more hiding, no more lies." Grace's heart thudded, she saw the fire in his eyes, but also the danger. "If you go against them, they'll make you pay, you could lose everything." "Grace," he said, taking her hands in his, "what's everything worth if it means I lose you?" For a moment silence filled the room, broken only by the sound of cars rushing by outside. Then Grace whispered the truth she had been afraid to say. "And what if by choosing me, you drag me into a war I can't win?" Before Charles could answer, the bookstore door creaked open. Margaret Sinclair stepped inside, her presence sharp and commanding even without the glittering gown she wore at galas. Tonight she was dressed in black, her voice like a blade. "I warned you, Charles," she said coolly, "this woman will destroy you." Grace stiffened, but Charles positioned himself in front of her, his tone ice cold. "No, Margaret, she's the only reason I'm not already destroyed." Margaret's lips curled in disdain. "Do you really believe she belongs in your world? Do you think the shareholders will trust you if you parade around with a bookstore clerk who doesn't understand what it means to carry our name?" Grace stepped out from behind Charles, her voice steady despite the fear tightening her chest. "Maybe I don't understand your name, Marga. Right. But I understand integrity, I understand standing beside someone when the world wants to tear them apart. Can you say the same? For the first time, Margaret faltered, her eyes narrowing, but she did not answer. Charles's voice cut through the silence. Tomorrow at the board meeting, I'll make it clear. If they want Whitmore Industries, they'll have to accept Grace, and if they don't, they can have the company without me. Margaret's eyes widened. You would walk away from an empire built for you. I would walk toward a life built with her, he said firmly. Grace's breath caught, the weight of his words sinking deep into her. This wasn't a declaration made in secret or whispered in the dark. This was a vow to stand against everything he had been raised to protect. Margaret's face hardened. Then you've chosen your ruin. She turned and swept out into the night, leaving the air charged with unspoken threats. Grace turned to Charles, trembling. You meant it, didn't you? You'd give it all up. His blue eyes softened as he cupped her face in his hands. Grace, from the moment you asked me to pretend on that sidewalk, I stopped caring about empires. You made me remember what it feels like to live, not just exist. I won't lose that, I won't lose you. Tears filled her eyes, not of fear this time but of certainty. She leaned into his touch, her voice breaking into a whisper. Then we fight together, whatever comes, we don't back down. Charles kissed her, and this time there was no pretense, no performance for anyone else's eyes. It was a kiss of defiance, of unity, of a future they would carve out no matter the cost. Outside, the city roared on, unaware that inside a small bookstore a battle line had been drawn. Tomorrow would bring the boardroom, the headlines, the judgment of the powerful, but tonight belonged to them. Tonight was the moment Grace and Char chose love over fear, truth over lies, and each other over everything else. And with that choice, they knew the real war had only just begun.